Alfred the Great, 871 to 899. He was the King of Wessex from 871 to 899 and is the only English monarch honored with the title the Great. His reign came during one of the most dangerous times in Anglo-Saxon history, when waves of Viking raids threatened to engulf all of England. The Vikings had already conquered much of the land, and Wessex stood as the last major kingdom still resisting. Alfred's early reign was marked by near-constant fighting. In 878, he was forced to flee into hiding in the marshes after a surprise Viking attack. But he gathered his strength, rallied his people, and later that same year led a decisive victory at the Battle of Edington. That triumph forced the Viking leader Guthrum to accept baptism and withdraw into East Anglia, securing a fragile peace. What made Alfred legendary wasn't just his military resilience, but his vision of unity and learning. He reorganized defenses with fortified towns known as bays, created a navy to challenge Viking ships, and worked to preserve and promote education by translating Latin texts into English. These reforms gave Wessex the stability to eventually dominate all other Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. By the time of his death in 899, Alfred had transformed his kingdom from the edge of destruction into the foundation for a unified English state. His balance of warrior strength and reformer wisdom earned him his enduring title, Alfred the Great. William the Conqueror, 1066 to 1087. William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy and later King of England, was a man who completely transformed English history in a single dramatic campaign. In 1066, after the death of Edward the Confessor, William claimed that he had been promised the English throne. But the crown instead went to Harold Godwin's son, an English noble. William saw this as both betrayal and opportunity, so he gathered a massive invasion force and launched across the Channel. The two sides clashed at the Battle of Hastings in October 1066, one of the most famous battles in medieval history. Harold's seasoned army defended from a hilltop, but William cleverly used a mix of cavalry and feigned retreats to break the Saxon shield wall. By the end of the day, Harold was dead, struck in the eye according to legend, and William marched on London to be crowned King of England. William's victory wasn't just about a throne, it permanently reshaped the nation. He replaced much of the Anglo-Saxon nobility with loyal Norman lords, introduced French language and culture, and built a network of stone castles to secure control. The most iconic of them, the Tower of London, still stands today as his reminder. He also ordered the Domesday Book, a sweeping survey of land and wealth that became a cornerstone of medieval administration. By the time of his death in 1087, William had cemented the Norman dynasty, turning England into a powerful feudal kingdom connected to continental Europe. Though often remembered as a ruthless conqueror, his reign left a legacy so enduring that the story of England is forever divided into before and after 1066. Henry II, 1154 to 1189. Crowned in 1154, was one of the most energetic and complicated rulers in English history. By inheritance and marriage to the formidable Eleanor of Aquitaine, he controlled more territory in France than the French king himself, creating what became known as the Angevin Empire, stretching from Scotland down to the Pyrenees. At home, Henry made reforms that transformed English law. He strengthened the royal courts, developed trial by jury, and laid the foundations of what we now call common law, a system so enduring it still influences legal practice today across much of the world. But his reign wasn't just about orderly governance. It was also marked by towering conflicts. Most famously, Henry clashed bitterly with his one-time friend, Bishop Thomas Becket, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Their feud over church authority turned violent when four of Henry's knights murdered Becket in the cathedral in 1170, shocking Christendom and leaving the king to perform public penance. And then there was the family drama. Henry and Eleanor's marriage produced a brood of ambitious sons, including Richard the Lionheart and King John. But instead of loyalty, the royal household became a battleground, with his children rebelling against him more than once, often with Eleanor's backing. By the time of his death in 1189, Henry II had built administrative systems that would define English governance, yet he left behind a dynasty simmering with betrayal and conflict. His reign was a mix of justice, empire, and dysfunction, quite literally the father of England's most legendary kings and its most infamous one. Richard the Lionheart, 1189 to 1199, better known as Richard the Lionheart, became king in 1189 and is remembered less as a ruler of England and more as the archetype of the crusading warrior king. Tall, charismatic, and utterly fearless in battle, he spent only about 6 months of his entire reign on English soil, because his real focus was abroad. Almost immediately after his coronation, Richard poured his energy into leading the Third Crusade to the Holy Land, joining forces with allies like Philip II of France to confront the great Muslim leader Saladin. At battles such as Arsuf, Richard's military prowess was undeniable. Courage, clever tactics, and a near-reckless bravery on the field made him legendary even among his enemies. Though he never recaptured Jerusalem, His campaign secured a favorable truce that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the holy sites. Back in Europe, Richard's adventures often read like a medieval drama. On his return journey from a crusade, he was captured and held for ransom by Leopold of Austria, an episode so costly that England was nearly bankrupted to buy back its king. As a ruler, however, Richard cared little for administration, taxation, or governance. He viewed the kingdom primarily as a bank that funded his wars. Yet, despite this neglect, the sheer brilliance of his knightly image gave him a reputation so enduring that he became the model of chivalry for centuries afterward. Richard died in 1199 from a crossbow wound during a minor siege in France. Though his reign was brief and his domestic legacy thin, Richard the Lionheart endures as one of history's most celebrated warrior kings, forever more legend than ruler. King John, 1199 to 1216. Reign from 1199 to 1216, is remembered as one of the most infamous monarchs in English history, a ruler so unpopular that no later king ever dared to use his name again. John inherited the throne after Richard the Lionheart's death, but where Richard was celebrated as a heroic warrior, John gained a reputation for suspicion, cruelty, and failure. Early in his reign, he lost control of vast French lands, including Normandy, after clashing with King Philip II of France. These defeats crippled England's continental empire and damaged John's prestige. At home, things went from bad to worse. John raised heavy taxes to fund his wars, seized lands from nobles, and manipulated the justice system for his own advantage. His harsh rule bred intense resentment among the barons. Matters finally came to a head in 1215, when John was forced at Runnymede to accept the Magna Carta, a charter of rights that limited royal power and placed the king under the law. While John attempted to wriggle out of it almost immediately, the Magna Carta became one of the cornerstones of English constitutional history. John's reign ended in turmoil. He descended into civil war against his own barons, and while campaigning in 1216, he died of illness, leaving the kingdom exhausted and deeply fractured. Though despised in his own time and condemned by chroniclers as Bad King John, his unintended legacy, the Magna Carta, ensured his name would be remembered forever. In a strange way, his failings helped lay the groundwork for the idea of limited monarchy and the rule of law. Edward I, 1272 to 1307, ruled from 1272 to 1307, was one of the most forceful and formidable kings of medieval England. Known to history as the Hammer of the Scots, he built his reputation on relentless expansion through conquest and an iron-fisted style of kingship. His first major target was Wales. Edward launched a ruthless campaign against the Welsh princes in the 1270s and 1280s, crushing resistance and constructing a ring of massive stone castles, Carnarvon, Conwy, Hulloch, that still dominate the landscape today. To cement his conquest, he proclaimed his son the first Prince of Wales, a title that survives in the royal family to this day. After Wales, Edward turned his attention northward to Scotland. Following the death of the Scottish king, a succession dispute gave him the chance to intervene. At first, he styled himself as Overlord of Scotland, but soon open war erupted. His early campaigns were brutal and successful, capturing leaders like William Wallace and attempting to subdue Scotland by force. Yet Scottish resistance continued under figures like Robert the Bruce, meaning Edward's dream of complete domination was unfinished when he died in 1307 while marching north once again. Beyond warfare, Edward also transformed English governance. He summoned one of the earliest versions of Parliament, including not just nobles but representatives from towns, an early step toward broader political participation. Edward I left behind a legacy of castles, conquests, and controversy. To his supporters, he was a great lawgiver and a warrior king. To his enemies, a ruthless oppressor. But there's no denying that his long reign reshaped both the physical and political landscape of Britain, powerful enough to earn him his fearsome nickname. Henry V, 1413 to 1422, reigned from 1413 to 1422 and became one of the most celebrated warrior kings in English history. His short reign was dominated by one dazzling achievement, the Battle of Agincourt, which secured his place in legend. When Henry came to the throne, England was still locked in the long and bitter 100 Years' War with France. In 1415, Henry launched a daring campaign to press his claims to the French crown. After capturing the port of Harfleur, his army, sick, exhausted, and badly outnumbered, was intercepted by a massive French force near the village of Agincourt. What followed was one of the most famous battles of the Middle Ages. Against all odds, Henry's disciplined archers and clever use of muddy terrain devastated the heavily armored French knights, turning what seemed like certain defeat into a stunning victory. The triumph made Henry a hero across Europe and the embodiment of English valor. He pressed his advantage further, negotiating the Treaty of Troyes in 1420, which recognized him as heir to the French throne and sealed the deal with his marriage to Catherine of Valois. It seemed Henry had achieved the impossible, uniting England and France under one crown. But Henry's meteoric rise was cut tragically short. In 1422, at the age of just 35, he died of illness while campaigning in France. His baby son, Henry VI, inherited the throne, and with it a fragile empire that would soon unravel. Even so, Henry V remains the classic medieval king, a warrior, a hero, and the man who turned a muddy French field into one of England's greatest victories. Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, reigned from 1509 to 1547, is easily the most notorious of all English kings, a ruler remembered as much for his 6 marriages as for the seismic religious transformation he unleashed. Early in his reign, Henry was every bit the Renaissance prince, athletic, charming, and cultured. But his obsession with securing a male heir set off a chain of events that changed the course of English history. When the Pope refused to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry took a radical step. He broke away from the Catholic Church, declaring himself supreme head of the Church of England. This act, known as the English Reformation, not only gave him power over religion but also allowed him to dissolve the monasteries, seizing immense wealth and land for the crown. His personal life became the stuff of legend. From Catherine to the tragic Anne Boleyn, the brief happiness of Jane Seymour, and 3 more wives after that, his marital drama was riddled with divorces, annulments, and executions. The saying that he divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived has made his reign as infamous as it is memorable. Politically, Henry strengthened royal authority, built up the navy, and projected England as a rising European power. But he also left behind mounting debts, religious divisions, and 2 much-debated successors, the sickly Edward VI and the ill-fated Mary I, before the crown finally passed to Elizabeth I. By his death in 1547, Henry VIII had reshaped the monarchy, the church, and the future of the nation. Larger than life, ruthless, and endlessly fascinating, his reign was nothing short of revolutionary, and scandalous enough to echo down the centuries. Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, came to the throne in 1558 and would reign for 45 years as one of England's most brilliant and iconic monarchs. Known as the Virgin Queen, she never married, but her reign saw the birth of a powerful new national identity. Elizabeth inherited a kingdom divided by her father's break with Rome and her sister Mary's attempt to restore Catholicism. Walking a careful line, Elizabeth established the Elizabethan religious settlement, which gave England a Protestant church while avoiding extremes. This brought a measure of stability to a nation racked with fear and division. Her reign was threatened by enemies abroad and at home. Catholic plots swirled, and her cousin Mary, Queen of Scots, became the rallying figure for conspiracies. Elizabeth finally ordered Mary's execution in 1587, a moment heavy with both necessity and controversy. The following year came Elizabeth's greatest test, the Spanish Armada. King Philip II of Spain launched a massive fleet to invade England, but storms, nimble English ships, and sheer luck scattered the Armada in a humiliating defeat. It cemented Elizabeth as the defender of her realm. Beyond politics and war, her reign became a cultural golden age. Playwrights like William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe flourished, as did exploration under figures like Sir Francis Drake. England, once fragile and uncertain, emerged as a confident rising power on the world stage. When Elizabeth died childless in 1603, the Tudor dynasty ended. Yet her image, the wise, commanding queen who reigned alone, became legendary. Her rule is still remembered as the Elizabethan Age, a period of triumph, creativity, and national pride. Charles I, 1625 to 1649, ruled from 1625 to 1649, and his reign became one of the most dramatic turning points in English history, a clash of kingship and parliament that exploded into civil war. From the start, Charles believed strongly in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs ruled by God's will and were answerable to no one. But Parliament resisted his heavy taxes, religious policies, and reliance on unpopular advisers. When tension spiked, Charles dissolved Parliament multiple times, trying to rule on his own in what became known as the personal rule. By the 1640s, opposition had hardened into open conflict. Fears of Charles's Catholic sympathies and his attempts to impose religious changes in Scotland pushed nobles and commoners alike into rebellion. The standoff escalated into the English Civil War, dividing the country between royalists, who backed the king, and parliamentarians, led by figures like Oliver Cromwell. Charles's forces fought valiantly, but the parliamentarians proved too organized and disciplined. After years of bloody fighting, Charles was captured, put on trial, and accused of treason against his own people. In January 1649, in an almost unthinkable act, the king was executed in front of a stunned crowd outside Whitehall Palace, his head struck off with one blow. The monarchy was abolished, and England briefly became a republic under Cromwell. Though the monarchy would eventually be restored, Charles I's downfall marked a permanent shift in the balance of power. It proved that a king could no longer rule without Parliament, and it set the stage for the constitutional monarchy that defines Britain today. Charles II, 1660 to 1685, known as the Merry Monarch, reigned from 1660 to 1685 and symbolized the dramatic swing of fortune after the grim years of civil war and Cromwell's republic. For much of his early life, Charles lived in exile, moving from court to court across Europe while England was ruled first by Parliament and then by Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell. But when Cromwell's regime collapsed, the nation invited Charles back in 1660 in a jubilant moment remembered as the Restoration. London erupted in celebration, and Charles quickly earned his reputation for charm, wit, and an indulgent court life. His reign, however, was far from simple merriment. England faced enormous challenges, including the devastating Great Plague of 1665 and the Great Fire of London the following year. Charles also fought the Dutch in a series of naval wars and navigated Europe's dangerous politics while maintaining his throne at home. Despite his easygoing image, Charles understood the dangers of defying Parliament in the way his father had. Although he longed for more royal power, he ruled with caution and pragmatism, avoiding another catastrophic showdown. Still, his secret negotiations with Catholic France and his own sympathies for Catholicism stirred ongoing tension in a country still fiercely Protestant. In the end, Charles II restored stability to a monarchy that had seemed fatally broken. To his enemies he was frivolous, to his friends he was entertaining, and to history he remains the king who brought back laughter and spectacle after years of war and austerity. His reign marked not just a restoration of kings but a new kind of monarchy, one tempered by the hard lessons of revolution. William III and Mary II, 1689 to 1702, became England's first and only set of joint monarchs, invited to rule together in one of the most important turning points in British history, the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Mary was the Protestant daughter of the controversial Catholic king, James II. When James tried to impose his pro-Catholic policies, fears of absolutism and religious upheaval spread across the nation. Parliament acted, secretly inviting Mary and her Dutch husband, William of Orange, to come to England. William landed with an army, James fled without a fight, and the throne passed to William and Mary, a transfer of power so bloodless it earned the name Glorious. As dual sovereigns, they accepted strict new limits on royal authority. Most crucially, they signed the Bill of Rights in 1689, which permanently enshrined parliamentary power over taxation, laws, and succession. This document became a cornerstone of English constitutional monarchy and inspired democratic traditions well beyond Britain. During their reign, William and Mary also navigated wars in Europe, particularly against Louis XIV of France, and William emerged as a capable military leader on the continent. At home, they stabilized Protestant rule, securing the future of the Church of England. Mary's death in 1694 left William ruling alone, but the legacy of their shared reign was clear. Together, they had ended the era of unchecked royal absolutism and established the precedent that kings and queens would govern with Parliament, not above it. Queen Anne, 1702 to 1714. The last of the Stuarts, ruled from 1702 to 1714 and presided over a reign that was both politically transformative and marked by great military triumphs, and came to the throne after William III's death, a reserved, devout woman in sharp contrast to the flamboyant, merry monarchs before her. Despite poor health, she suffered from lifelong illness and endured 17 heartbreaking pregnancies without a surviving heir, and proved a steady hand during a turbulent era. Her greatest achievement at home was the Active Union of 1707, which formally joined England and Scotland into a single kingdom, Great Britain. From that moment, the island was united under one parliament and one crown, a political reality that still shapes Britain today. Abroad, Anne's reign was dominated by the War of the Spanish Succession, a struggle to keep France from dominating Europe. Under brilliant generals like the Duke of Marlborough, British forces won major victories at battles such as Blenheim, cementing England's reputation as a rising military power. These successes also began the gradual expansion of Britain's influence overseas. Yet her court was no less dramatic, and relied heavily on close female confidants like Sarah Churchill, Duchess of Marlborough, whose fiery relationship with the Queen fueled intrigue and political rivalries. When Anne died in 1714 without an heir, the crown passed to the Hanoverian dynasty, beginning a new royal chapter. Though perhaps less glamorous than Elizabeth or Victoria, Anne's reign created lasting change. A united Britain with growing military strength and a clear path into its future as a major European and global power. Queen Victoria, 1837 to 1901. Reigned from 1837 to 1901, an astonishing 63 years that defined an entire age. Her name became synonymous with the Victorian era, a period of empire, industry, and immense social change. Ascending the throne at just 18 years old, Victoria quickly established herself as a determined and dignified monarch. Through her long reign, she became a figure of extraordinary stability, a symbolic mother of the nation even as Britain raced through dizzying transformations brought by the Industrial Revolution. Cities expanded, railways spanned the country, and inventions reshaped everyday life. At the same time, Britain became the dominant world power. Under Victoria, the British Empire expanded to its greatest territorial extent, prompting the famous phrase that the sun never sets on the British Empire. Her reign gave Britain confidence as a global superpower, while also raising debates over the costs of imperialism and social inequality at home. Her marriage to Prince Albert was a true partnership. Together they championed education, science, and public morality. His death in 1861, however, sent Victoria into decades of mourning. She famously wore black for the rest of her life. Still, she remained politically influential, consulting with a who's who of prime ministers from Lord Melbourne to Benjamin Disraeli. By the time of her death in 1901, Victoria was not just Queen of the United Kingdom but Empress of India, matriarch of Europe's royal families, and the living embodiment of an age of progress, pride, and empire. Her long reign left an imprint so vast that historians still speak of Britain's Victorian character, even today. Elizabeth II, 1952 to 2022, became queen in 1952 at the age of just 25, following the sudden death of her father, George VI. Over the next 70 years, she would preside over a monarchy that changed more in her lifetime than in any that came before her. Her reign began at a moment when Britain was still emerging from World War II, but rapidly shedding its empire. During her time, colonies across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean gained independence, and Britain transitioned from imperial superpower to modern constitutional state. Through it all, Elizabeth's steady presence made her a symbol of continuity during decades of social, political, and cultural upheaval. She met with prime ministers from Winston Churchill to Liz Truss, 15 in all, and worked with more heads of state than any leader in history. While her formal powers were limited, her sense of duty, discipline, and composure gave stability to the monarchy, especially during crises like economic downturns, family scandals, and criticism of the royal institution itself. Elizabeth became a global icon. From glittering state visits to her Christmas broadcasts, she was known and recognized in every corner of the world, embodying quiet resilience and understated strength. She adapted carefully with the times, televising her coronation, embracing new technology, and cautiously modernizing the monarchy without losing its traditions. When she passed away in 2022, Elizabeth II had reigned longer than any monarch in British history. To millions, she will always represent duty, service, and the unbroken thread of the crown across a rapidly changing age. Her legacy is not measured in conquest or reform, but in the quiet constancy of a queen who became the heartbeat of Britain for 7 decades.